Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. We've rolled out of our 8-bit chapter into episode 256. Along the way, we've doubled our listeners. So a huge thank you to everyone who's downloaded and shared an episode. Please continue to do so, and also to let us know what topics you'd like to hear more of. And don't worry, more fun intros are coming. It's the same show after all, only now it has double the bite. Which means this week we chat with Kirsten, Newcomer from Red Hat, about securing a supply chain with containers and building a pipeline that's predictable and protected. In the news segment, revisiting Equifax's breach, reviewing CISA's 1,000 vulns, replacing OpenSSL with Rust, revising Go's loops, rethinking complexity versus design, and more. Think big and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
This is episode 256, recorded September 25th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mike, I'm here to continue the AppSec Torture Tribunal one bit at a time.
The Torture Tribunal. I always appreciate a good alliteration. That's wonderful. Thank you for that one. Especially we're coming into October, so we'll throw you in from the Tales of the Crypt Keeper with some good Torture Tribunal puns as well, perhaps. So while John is thinking of that, the rest of you, as members of the Security Weekly community, you can receive a 50% off your AIDC 2023 tickets using code CRA50OFF. Join us October 4th, 2023 in Pentagon City. ICIT, the nation's #1 security think tank, cybersecurity think tank, brings together America's leading minds to discuss AI's impact on the country. Register today at securityweekly.com/AIDC 2023. Kirsten works closely with Red Hat's many security professionals across their portfolio of open source offerings. She is a diversified software management professional with 15 plus years of experience in app development and infrastructure solutions. Prior to joining Red Hat, Kirsten provided strategic direction for Black Duck's open source security and governance solutions. Her career has spanned roles at IBM, Rational Software, and BMC Software. Kirsten was also an early contributor to the Linux Foundation's SPDX spec. Hello, Kirsten. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike, John, great to be here with you both. So
we're happy to have you here because SPDX is one of those seeds that we kind of want to talk about, but more generally, supply chain. And supply chain, we were chatting before, offline, kind of prepping for this, and supply chain and S-BOMs, they're pretty new and hot just in the sense of SolarWinds. Everyone likes to talk about them. But I was looking back at SPDX, and these are not necessarily new concepts, are they?
This is true. So soft SPDX, protocol, for data exchange, package data exchange protocol, right? God, you'd think I'd remember. But it has been a while since 1.0 was released. So the concept of having a software bill of materials for a set of distributed software really isn't new. And in fact, when I was at Black Duck, right, they had the concept of kind of creating this ingredients label that showed you all the open source in the software and the licenses associated with that open source, just kind of similar to what you'd see on the back of a can of food that you were buying. So it has been around for a long time. It's primarily been the focus early on was license compliance, open source license compliance, right? And especially for software distributors who were in the embedded space, software on your cell phone, software in your car, which actually there's been a lot of software in cars for a long time too. There's just a lot more now than there used to be. But the anybody doing embedded software had to worry about the GPL license in particular and complying with GPL. And so that was quite a strong business, but kind of niche. Over time, companies like Black Duck, which got acquired by Synopsys, and Palameda, I forgot who they got acquired by. They kind of morphed into software composition analysis. Which was more general purpose, and then expanded from there into vulnerability data, right? So license data being incredibly useful for a subset of the market, but everybody needs to know what software is in their packages so that they can map to vulnerability data and better manage those vulnerabilities. So that's actually been around for a while.
And it is. And even with, SPDX, it has, part of it is, including licensing, as you said, and useful security references. And
Yes.
From the website. And those useful security references are relatively vuln-oriented. Not necessarily a bad thing. We need to know what are the log4js, the other standard, the usual suspects of what vuln or what package is in here. But there is still a lot more to supply chain security, even than S-BOMs, than just the vulns. And I think one of the things maybe too is kind of, you haven't said this, I don't think we say this, but S-BOMs aren't going to fix everything. And I think one of the things is to figure out, there's a specific threat model that they address, actually maybe even just a specific bit of information that they address. So maybe help us position S-BOMs for their purpose and that larger aspect of what supply chain security means in the sense of, building secure software too.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think, as you say, S-BOM really is a collection of data, a software bill of materials. It's a collection of data. And even when it has useful links, security data, or links to vulnerabilities, typically, frankly, the content of your software package, whatever you get it, whatever form, is it an ISO, is it a jar file, a WAR file, whatever form it's in, once you've received it, it's unlikely to change. However, known vulnerabilities change every day. So a software bill of materials at some point gets to a reasonable stasis. We'll talk about how you track that. The vulnerability data changes all the time. So you want that association between the data in your S-BOM and the vulnerabilities, but you don't necessarily want to store that vuln data in your S-BOM because you'll be updating it every time a new vulnerability is discovered. So a linkage is a much more appropriate way to kind of manage that, given the volatility on the vulnerability side. But as you said, sort of a supply chain it's called a chain for a reason, right? It has many pieces to the process of getting code put together, developed, put together, packaged, delivered to the end user. These days, supply chain, when I started working with app development, supply chain was all about my build process, my source code control system, my build process for getting my code compiled. How do I package it and get it out the door? It's really expanded. Those are still key elements. CI and CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment, have kind of expanded. And then also we're starting to see supply chain be talked about for infrastructure as well, as organizations move from not just managing their code, their applications in a CI/CD process, but also their infrastructure as code and moving it through a CI/CD process. So for me, supply chains include content, the tools I use to manage content. The content can be of various types. It might be source code. It might be YAML files. Let's stick with applications. I still need especially if I'm doing a containerized app for Kubernetes. I need a deployment config. I need, config map. I need a range of additional content. I might have a Kubernetes network policy file that goes with my application, with my pod. I have a whole bunch of content that is not limited to the custom code I'm writing for the source code I'm writing. I might be pulling in a base image for the system dependencies in that containerized app. All of that content needs to be managed effectively, carefully. It needs to be secured. It needs to be evaluated. The custom code I'm writing needs to be evaluated. And I need to secure the pipeline, the tools I'm using, and everything as it moves through the pipeline, right? You mentioned SolarWinds, and that SolarWinds hack is part of what brought so much attention to the steps in the pipeline and tracking those steps and validating and verifying that what happened in my CI/CD process is what I expected to happen, and it wasn't tampered with. The content wasn't tampered with, and the process itself wasn't tampered
Yeah,
with.
avoiding surprise is one of those biggest things that security orgs want to do. And SolarWinds is probably a good example because their approach to, their response was rather than build once, let's build twice or build multiple times and then to compare what happens. Now, I don't know what's the quote from Contact, why build one at one price when you could build two at twice the price? That's, I guess, one way of doing attestation, checking that growth of attack surface. Because when I heard you describing and not mentioning, thank you, shift left of all these touch points of security where you're testing the YAML config and all these are just touch points to say, this needs to be built, this needs to be connected in, here's some secrets access, here's the environment access, here's the build. That's a lot of attack surface for attackers to go after. So what does this look like if we do talk about trying to secure a supply chain and have those attestation steps, like you were saying? How do we balance that in the sense of it works for developers, but we actually do have some confidence that we can take a snapshot and a hash at this point and think, well, probably nobody mucked about with our code.
Yeah. So, and I really do like what SolarWinds did. They did it in a fashion that was automated. And I also, even though I didn't say it, I am a firm believer in shift left and in empowering the developer. So I think that security teams' role is to provide guardrails in terms of what are the kinds of checks that need to happen. But one of the challenges that remains, sometimes I talk about this in terms of people, process, and technology. So as new threats emerge, as we become cognizant of these new things, and as new technologies emerge, like the predominance of containers and Kubernetes today, you sometimes need to look at how you are approaching security in new ways. So it's not so much that the principles of security change, but the tools you use to apply those principles may change, and where you apply those principles may change. So a secure CI/CD pipeline is really important if you are doing containerized apps, especially. I mean, it's important for everybody. And I should say that secure can be a tough word because it's really hard to ensure that there is 100% security, right? That's a dream we all have, but a very challenging thing to work towards. So when it comes to securing that pipeline, we want appropriate checks. And the reason I like shift left is that really to get effective checks and appropriate checks in that app dev pipeline, there are a couple of reasons I like it. The security teams and the app dev teams really need to talk together. And the security teams ideally become partners with the business, because in the end, it is a business. The applications are driving business. They're driving value, whether it's internal or external. that manage the business. Every business is a digital business these days and run by software.
Yeah, I want
And
to, if
go
I
ahead.
can, I wanted to open that up a bit too,
Yeah.
because we do talk about the partnering with development, and there's a lot of putting this shifting onto the developers to manage these containers, manage a lot of these tools that you're talking about. What does that look like? Are there certain businesses where this works better than others? And here I'm thinking of, do you need a dedicated build tooling team to handle the complexity of containerization? Is this something that developers can take on the side? Because it incidentally can also automate and make the build process easier for them in terms of lowering build time,
Yeah.
things like that. That's what I'm curious, what that collaboration perhaps looks like, and is sort of making sure that AppSec just doesn't say, well, go do this list of things I told you to do. And by the way, it has a lot of engineering behind it.
Yes, no, that's a really great question, and I think it can depend on the size of the team. So, an example as to when it might make a dev teams easier, and then I'll come back to, do I
Mhm.
need a dedicated team? But shifting left can make life easier for the app developer because they are getting security feedback, if done right, early in the process, ideally in the tools they use every day. So this doesn't work necessarily if the security team dictates what tool should be used. They should have the requirements for what is needed from security tooling, but app dev teams should be the major stakeholder in selecting what's going to work best in their CI/CD process in order to get this data. Ideally, the information is surfaced in the tools they use every day early in the process. It's cheaper to fix any issue, security, bug, whatever it is. It's cheaper to fix early in the process than later in the process. And to your point about how complex does the pipeline become? That comes back to how many guardrails are we putting in place? What are they? What are the tools required to meet those guardrails? You know, do I need to do security static analysis? Do I need to do runtime security analysis? Pretty much everybody is doing vulnerability analysis on static content. There's only so much information you get when you're doing vulnerability analysis on static content. You don't know, is that application going to be exposed to the internet or not? Or you may not know. Are you tracking that? Some organizations categorize their apps by risk category. And in my mind, that should feed into how you prioritize vulnerabilities. But you are right that this can be complex. And I think it depends on the size of the organization and their needs as to whether they have a separate team. Um, but also that guidance as to what needs to be in my pipeline should be built in conversation. The teams that I have seen be most successful here is, like, I know of an organization, it happened to be US government, where their chief of cybersecurity required his team to learn something about the app dev pipeline tools. They had to understand enough that they could have an effective conversation with the app dev team. And the app developers may not ever become strong security experts, but like most engineers, app dev teams respond better when they understand the why behind a reason. If I am being asked to run this tool, what's the real goal? What are the threats that you're concerned about? They want to be part of that conversation. And then there's always, it really shouldn't be, as I mentioned earlier, it's really about risk and risk to the business. So, how do we evaluate the risk of the security threats versus the risk of not getting the functionality out that I need? And how do we have a conversation together about balancing those risks so that it becomes a team? And so shift left for me has to also be complemented by shift right, to be a little cute about it, right? DevSecOps is not just adding security checks in my pipeline. DevSecOps includes ops. I still need to be evaluating and managing security in my operational environment. The need for those security tools doesn't go away, but I also want the information from each section to inform the other, right? If I discover information about an application vulnerability in the pipeline, but I can't fix that right away because I have business needs to get it out. What are the mitigating controls I can put in place in the ops environment? If I discover something in runtime, how do I quickly get that information back to the app dev team so that they can do something about it? And again, back to why is this so important for containerized apps? You need to always rebuild and redeploy. Patching a running container instance in a Kubernetes environment is only for emergencies, because Kubernetes is going to notice if that instance goes down. It's going to redeploy from the static image. You're going to lose your fix. So your config is being managed as code, and you need, in a Kubernetes environment, declarative environment. You need,
Yeah. And I like that, because a lot of that
yeah,
speaks to the point of, let's have discipline around our build and how we are interacting with prod, meaning no humans are touching prod systems. Let's build some code, have that code deployed. And one of the things where our conversation, this often happens talking about supply chain, is we get pulled into the vulnerability aspect of it.
Oh, I know.
Meaning,
Yeah.
here's supply chain, here's another chance to run this security scanner. This security scanner is the code that we built secure when it hit production. Whereas a lot of supply chain, even SBOMs, are more, I think, about, is the code I wrote the code that got built and packaged into that artifact in production? And that's where some of this, and I'm curious, let's have that conversation about why with developers. Is it harder? It does sound easier to talk about vulns. Here's the scanner. Here's what I identified. But it seems like we always come around to talking about those vulns rather than just, here's the hash of what you built. Here is how we have more confidence that no other process mucked about with the code when it was built. And that's a little bit more nuanced. I'm curious. Let's bring it back to that aspect too, and tell us how you've seen those conversations go.
Yeah. So integrity of the code as it moves through the pipeline, and integrity of the pipeline itself. And I think this is a place where I think the community, the open source community, has been investing and evolving. And we are still struggling in large organizations with a lot of legacy pipelines to kind of move in this direction. So solutions like sigstore.dev, were really developed. So I've been working, with containers and kube for longer than I've been at Red Hat. I've been asked about signing container images and validating signatures on admission. And there's actually capabilities out there for both. But it's been really challenging to get strong adoption, partly because there's kind of this conflict with a lot of the, in the enterprises, with a lot of the enterprise signing tools that people are used to using, right? They aren't designed for use in a pipeline. They aren't easy. Developers might have to say, hey, I need this signed, and it goes off. Do they have to put that in through some sort of workflow to ask? It goes off into the Netherlands. It takes a while. It eventually comes back as signed, but it slows them down. And Sigstore is really designed to address that problem from the developer's angle. So it has multiple components, one of which is cosign. It's also kind of designed initially for containers, but expanding beyond that. And you can it can be backed by either an enterprise PKI system, or you could use something like your SSO login, an OIDC-based keyless signing. Much easier to integrate into a pipeline, works at kind of the speed that the developer works. And so when you look at signing, again, we want to think about not just the content and the integrity of the content as it moves through. And I want to come back to how that applies to SBOMs too. But also the tasks that the pipeline is running. And this is where SolarWinds, so even though, yes, they're building twice, that second run is fully automated. And in both cases, they are using Cosign with Tecton chains. They happen to be using kind of a Kubernetes native pipeline that lets you manage your pipeline as code as well. And they can attest to the each task run. And so part of what they're able to do, right? So Tecton has tasks. There's this whole Tecton hub of, world of integration written as code that you can leverage. But you use Cosign to sign those task runs. And when you run it twice, they can sign each and then check the hashes against each other to make sure that nothing was tampered with at each step along the way. And they really needed to go this far. Not every organization does, but doing that once and attesting to the steps in your pipeline gives you a way to answer questions that customers are starting to ask.
Yeah, and I'm curious too. And you mentioned like the SigStore Cosign. These are more developer-friendly tools, especially being able to do the non-PKI version. Because who has enterprise PKI these days that is not brittle or easy to maintain? So I'm curious then too. Whether it's Tecton or something else, there's a lot of things that, in terms of having that confidence for that attestation, you need to know that these other people, other developers didn't have access, or you need to know, perhaps inverting that, who did have access, and did they do some in-memory manipulation of the code, a la SolarWinds, or did they do something else? So is that subtlety of, hey, developers, we're actually taking away some of your capabilities? Is that been something that's a contributor to why hardened pipelines are more difficult, or is that part of a conversation that comes up?
I'm not convinced we're taking anything away, but I am convinced that pipelines are complex. And like if you look at some of the proposals coming out of salsa.dev, SLSA, which is a great project and initiative, and a lot of very smart people working on that, the requirements can get quite intense and complex. What I think you are calling out is that, especially with a solution like Cosign from SigStore, and Tecton Chains is the piece that uses Cosign for that task attestation, you're moving your focus from, okay, I have tight control over who has access to my PKI and who can do signing, to I have to have really tight control of authentication and authorization for my OIDC-based signing, which means that everyone in the organization, is subject to maybe two-factor authentication, or, so I have to really manage authn and authc for my internal systems tightly and carefully. So identity is really important. Integrity, identity really matters. And so especially as I shift left, and I have to tightly manage access to my source code control systems, to my binary repositories, right? Access control for my internal systems kind of becomes a stronger focus, rather than just and frankly, honestly, perimeter-based security is sort of old school anyway. The reality is that, a lot of the customers I work with worry about insider threat. It's not so much about, they just want to protect against any possible threat.
Absolutely. And one of those ways we've seen too, you mentioned earlier on, one of the types of artifacts being built is infrastructure as code, for example. Just a way to, let's express through YAML that is mostly human readable, human reasonable, and you can lint through something like that. So I think you kind of alluded to a pipeline as code as well, which seems like a better way of just
I did.
expressing this pipeline so you can have that understanding of who's allowed to access when, what is the strong identity. Do you see that pipeline as code being a great thing to reach for, but complex, and you need containerization to do because containers have properties that help that? Or what's it, how do we get to a pipeline as code that's
Got
as
it.
easy rolls off the tongue as IAC?
so, so I think it is a place where Kubernetes helps, and Tecton was really designed for that. Again, so if we recognize that Kubernetes was designed to be a declarative system, with your configurations managed as code, app configurations. Now, they didn't apply that concept to the platform itself, although there are clever ways you can do that using Kubernetes operators. But the Tecton pipeline is, in fact, designed to be a pipeline delivered as code that you can deploy onto any Kubernetes cluster from wherever you have stored your Tecton tasks. You may have pulled some of those tasks down from a hub, just like if you're doing containerized apps, you pull your base image down from a hub. So it's a similar approach, and at the same time, that also means again that I want to be really managing the integrity of the content for the pipeline, which is why Tecton Chains is such an important piece. But it's also, I'm going to use some similar concepts. If I've got a YAML file, I should, for configuration or a Tecton task, I should be able to have a signature for that and verify the signature as well. So you conceptually can apply the same thing. I think what's hard is not, I think Tecton makes this reasonably easy to do. What's hard is that organizations who have existing pipelines have invested a ton of energy and customization and time into the process and the code that supports those pipelines. And moving my business critical app from one pipeline to another is time consuming, and it's time that I am not spending on feature functionality for the app itself. And
Absolutely.
so,
And
yeah,
that's one of those tough trade-offs. And as you said, you have to have that conversation with the business. I
yeah,
want to switch our perspective
sure,
just slightly right now because we've been talking about essentially generating that trust, or generating that integrity at the end, that is the SBOM, or that just says the code I wrote is actually the same code that was compiled and deployed to production.
mhm.
But what does this look like from like a consumer perspective? As someone who's either taking in another open source package as a dependency, or just the consumers, even maybe from a SaaS perspective, but sort of the, why do I care, other than I like looking at, nutrition labels on boxes, sort of, there's got to be some point that we're doing all of this work for, other than just to keep AppSec
That
people
makes
in
it
business.
easier, right?
Yes.
Yes. Well, for one thing, there are executive orders in the
Hmm.
states, at least, that
Fair point.
require
Yes.
delivery of an SBOM. So software providers need to do that. But the other reality is that, again, kind of if we circle back to um, the evolving threat landscape, if I know as a consumer, um, and this is frankly one of the advantages of open source software, is the amount of publicly available information on open source software. If I know what the open source software is in the SaaS product I'm using, or the code that I've gotten distributed and deployed on premises, I have that information. I don't have to go and figure out for myself And ideally, right, you'd be storing these SBOMs somewhere that you have easy access. I have kind of a pre-built inventory of the open source software in my organization. Of course, they'll also probably include some proprietary, names of proprietary components as well. I have that information, and if there is a new issue discovered, and you're likely to hear about it sooner if it's open source, in one of those components, I don't have to go and scan everything to figure out what I've got. I've got this inventory. I can do a mapping already of the newly discovered vulnerability, which of my products is likely, or at least where should I focus? Because when it's at the level of, the log4j issue or the spring for shell issue, I may not know that, did my SBOM get to the point of saying log4j is in there? It depends. It might have instead given me, I might know about, because that's one of the kind of next
Yeah, what's that
challenges with
granularity of the S-bomb?
SBOMs.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten into
Exactly.
that. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And you're going to get a more granular list when an SBOM is generated from source code than after it's been built and kind of packaged. You may get a higher level list. And also, especially in the Java world, there are transitive dependencies, things that aren't in the package I got from the vendor, but the code in that package pulls it down when it needs it from the Maven repo or wherever it happens.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like they solve the world's inventory problem, but they make it smaller. I have less that I need to do. Now I do want
that's
to,
appreciable. And I think too, even because not for the log4j, for example, it'd also be great to know, well, what were the configuration settings for this? Meaning,
oh my
did
gosh,
we configure
yes.
so that the log4j
Right.
attack path is present or not, has been mitigated,
Yeah.
or for, C, C++, what were the compile time hardening? Did we have stack canaries turned on and all those things?
And honestly, I don't know that information is going to be available easily from any vendor, that next level down.
Yeah. And that's what's interesting.
If you don't mind, I'm going to push back a little bit on this, Kirsten.
Please. Oh, cool. Yeah.
And these are not necessarily my own viewpoints, but let's sort of play a bit of a straw man. The U.S. government regulation around SBOM is a complete waste of time. It's just go have people creating a bunch of stuff for no good reason. That's my straw man. But in closer to reality, SBOMs are being generated. No one's able to read them. There's a ton. I mean, think about like just some of the things we've talked through here today. So Kubernetes, Tektron, SigStore. Add a few more in there. Each of these are like days and days and days of people's time to actually, if not weeks and weeks, right, to actually implement. I'm known nowadays as telling people not to run Kubernetes unless you really have to. So like we're putting a ton of time in here to like tell people to do all this type of stuff. And the result is this SBOM file, in theory, which very few people are actually using or reading or know how to parse or do something with. So really I guess what I'm looking for from you is you're closer and you're seeing how the stuff is used day to day than me right now. So are you seeing real world benefits from these things?
I think it's too soon to know the answer to that for the people who are dealing with SBOMs because the US government has said thou shalt. I think that where I have seen in my past life real benefit and where I envision us seeing benefit is, but I think it's going to be a while. It's kind of like, okay, because the next thing that's going to come up is how do I trust this SBOM? Right. So if I didn't generate it or I didn't run the tool that generated it and I just got handed a software bill of materials, how do I know that what's in that SBOM captures everything I care about in the software I also got handed? Which means that if it's a organization that is, really concerned about and follows the principle of trust but verify, they're going to go generate their own SBOM using a tool that's available to them. And so it does, in some ways, add more work, to your point. And yet, I also think it can get us to a place where, if we, as a community, as an industry, we get to a place where we really start sharing this content in a public repo that gets trusted, that has where the SBOM itself has a signature, where I can check the log of those signatures, that I get to a place where I have much more information available to me when it's time to select the open source I'm using. And pretty much everybody in the software industry is using open source. And there are multiple options for common functionality. And I think I don't think it's going to be fast, but I think we get to a place where, the concept of using base images really exploded. And there are a whole set of freely available container images out there in the world that you can use to compose your custom application. But how much do I know about them?
Right.
People have to scan those in enterprises before they can use them. Even if they get an SBOM with them, which is hopefully more detailed than what's in the Docker file, I still need to do, if we can get to the place as a industry where this information is more visible and more easily accessible. The emergence of VEX files is another thing in this space. I think we do get value, but I think it's going to take some time. And to your point about the tools, just if I can, I'm going to this is a throwback. There will be people in your audience who will never have heard of this, right?
Oh, no.
But release engineering has been a thing for many, many years. And I happen to have worked with ClearCase at Rational. I see, yeah, I know, look at that face. When it was one of the most prominent solutions in the space, which it really isn't any longer. And it was complex, but it did things nothing else did. And as the market evolved, it did, versioning of the files. And as the market evolved, and you could do a fully rebuildable, if you were doing C builds, you could get an audit trail that allowed you to see absolutely every step and fully redo that build. And it's interesting, we're kind of circling back to a world where that level of validation, or the ability to validate, is wanted. But yes, it adds complexity, and it means learning new tools. And will we get to a place where maybe the industry kind of settles on something a little less complex, but still valuable, which is kind of what I saw happen in the source code versioning space and
That's
the build
interesting.
space.
Yeah, because we see like Google has of course, I'm drawing a blank on the name, but Google has a project for basically curating. We're going to build and sign.
They're assured open source project.
Thank you. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
which Red Hat has been doing assured open source since its beginning, right? So, but it's moving. So it's going to be interesting to see where the trends go. Yeah.
Indeed. And so, and it's perhaps this length of time that we saw, is 10 plus years since that SPDX 1.0 was out. We need to see more of that value from the end users saying, we're getting value out of this, and the tools aren't so cumbersome that it's taking, not only do you building the software need to do the SBOM, but we as the consumers also don't trust your SBOM. So we're going to do all that work all over again.
Right. Right.
Oh,
and there are
exhausting.
there are a whole bunch of other tools that do that today. And in fact, SCA, right, software composition analysis, is a simpler way of building an SBOM.
Indeed. And I think, Kirsten, we've been very much focusing on integrity. And fortunately, we're running up against the limits of availability. So we've got to getting to the end here. But before we leave, I do want to change tacks real quick. And we ask all of our guests this year, describe AppSec in 3 words. And I'm curious what 3 words come to mind for you.
Yeah. And so I appreciate that you gave me a heads up to let out the secret that I was going to have to answer this question, because my 3 words are integrity, identity, and isolation. And we haven't talked about isolation, but isolation as potentially a stand-in for segmentation. And I would have loved to have continued more of the debate with you. So, all right.
We will indeed have to bring you back. But before we do let you go, is there anything else you want to highlight, Kirsten, for our listeners, where they can follow on some of and continue some of the discussions we've been having here?
Honestly, there's so much. I'll tell you, one of my favorite new things to poke at is zero trust. It is a marketing term, so you got to be careful not to follow the marketing fluff, but really be poking at what is the intent behind zero trust, and go find some good technical content on that. And then finally, I'll just let you all know that we do have Red Hat offers a product called Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security for Kubernetes, supports OpenShift, AKS, EKS, and GKE. We have a free trial available of our new cloud service. Would love to have anybody who's interested give it a try, send us some feedback. But loved this conversation. Thank you both so much, and would love to dig in more. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kirsten. We definitely don't want to isolate this conversation to a single episode, so we're going to have to expand that a bit. Thank you once again. Thank you to John. Thank you to everybody who's been listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.